Hello, my learning friends, and welcome to Hughes History. This one is for all my government lovers out there. We're going to hit you up with a little bit of the implied powers because you need to understand it. It's going to be on the exam. You could take it to the bank. So why don't we go giddy up for the learning and go get her done right now. So what are implied powers? In a very simple way, implied powers are not enumerated powers. And now you're like, Mr. Hughes, what are enumerated powers? Enumerated powers, sometimes called delegated powers, are powers that are specifically listed in the Constitution given to the federal government, right? We have a system of federalism. Federalism is the division of power between the federal and the state governments, and that federal government is given powers in the Constitution, and that power is enumerated, and a lot of it is enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, and a whole bunch of clauses where it talks about what the government can do. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about enumerated powers. We're not talking about the printed word. We're talking about the process to enact the printed word. Implied powers are those powers that we assume the government has and that spring forth from trying to complete the enumerated powers. Are you confused yet? Well, George Washington was a little bit confused, and he was torn on this issue. Should implied powers be broad, or should they be strict? And he's got a little guy on his left named Alexander Hamilton and a little guy on his right named Thomas Jefferson, and they're going to debate the point. So Alexander Hamilton has an idea. He wants to create a national bank. And he goes to Georgie and he says, Georgie, let's create a national bank. And Georgie says, I don't know if we have the constitutional power to create a national bank. I've looked at the Constitution. It just isn't in there. And Hamilton says, wait a minute. Now, you know that we have power to regulate the economy, regulate commerce, coin, money. Now, I want you to look at two pieces of the Constitution. This is what Alexander Hamilton says to George Washington. And he says the first one is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Boys and girls, listen up very carefully to the General Welfare Clause. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. General welfare. We need a national bank because it's in the general welfare for the country. It's what we need to do. And now, Georgie, I want you to look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the elastic clause. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Well, there you go. Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper in order to enact the enumerated powers. And if you pair that up with the whole general welfare thing, we can do this, and we can do much more. You see, Alexander Hamilton believes in a strong central government, and he believes the Constitution needs to be flexible because he thinks the founders wrote it that way because they didn't know what they didn't know, and they wanted to give the government the ability to survive. But George has to hear from another fellow, and that would be Thomas Jefferson. Now, if Alexander Hamilton believes that the elastic clause and the general welfare clause is a means to an end, that these are things that we can do because they're useful, because they're needed, because it's the right thing to do, Thomas Jefferson is like, no. That's not what we should be doing, and that's not what necessary and proper means, George. Necessary and proper means necessary, like vital, like oxygen is necessary to breathe. And a national bank isn't necessary, so therefore it is not constitutional. We can't do it. You see, Thomas wants a limited government. He fears central power, and he wants to put the reins on the Constitution so this whole implied power business doesn't get all out of whack in his view. So now George has a decision to make. So George sides with Alexander Hamilton. He decides, I'm going to put my signature on that puppy. I'm going to sign into law the national bank. And you know the rest of the story. And if you don't, go watch the video on McCulloch versus Maryland, where we learn that John Marshall is going to rule that the national bank is constitutional and an example of implied powers where we are using a process that's not enumerated in the Constitution, but is however constitutional because it is necessary and proper to enact a foregoing enumerated power. I bet you understood all of that. So who was right, who was wrong? You can leave it down in the comments below, but if you're looking for other examples of implied powers, you can find really them all over the place. Any federal action that is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution is an example of implied powers that's ripping from the General Welfare Clause, combined with the Elastic Clause. You can see examples in the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the draft for World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War, labels on cigarette packs, federal funding for education programs, food stamps, the regulation of monopolies, the list goes on and on. But are we better for it or are we worse for it? That is the question. And by no means should we not mention that this is all balanced out in federalism, all that stretchy language, with something called the 10th Amendment, which you can watch a video on right there, which basically says if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. What you talking about, Willis? So my friends, I hope your brain is bigger because that's what we do with Hip Hughes History. We grow the brains. It's like little chia pets. And make sure that if you haven't subscribed, you do that now and check us out online at www.hiphughes.com where you can go to the video arsenal where we have over 450 videos. It's cray. So you go do that right now and I'll remind you that where attention goes, energy flows. And we'll see you friends next time that you press my buttons.